Cooper stood in the cargo bay of the evacuation ship, watching the red zone fall away beneath him. The planet's rust-colored landscape stretched across the viewport like a scar. Most of the colonists cheered. They were leaving this hell behind. They were going home. Turned and walked back into the corridors of the ship. Nobody noticed him. That was always the case. The expedition commander had labeled him as difficult. The scientists had called him unreliable. The administrators had removed him from the main colony roster because he asked too many questions about their strategies. He had survived the first phase of colonization only because he was useful. Now that they were retreating, he was just another problem to transport out. He found his way to the storage section and slipped behind a stack of sealed containers. His heart beat hard in his chest. The ship shuddered as the final crew members boarded. The bay doors began to close, waited until he heard the magnetic seals engage. Then he moved. The emergency airlock release was easy. He had studied the ship's systems months ago, just in case. The ship was already in the launch sequence. Nobody was checking the lower decks. Pulled on his reinforced suit, secured his emergency pack, and cycled the airlock. The transport pod beneath the ship detached smoothly. By the time anyone realized what had happened, he was already descending toward the surface. The landing was rough but survivable. Dragged himself out of the pod and collapsed on the red soil. The sky above was dark orange. In the distance, the evacuation ship became a bright dot and then nothing. He was alone on 442B. The outpost was 17 kilometers away, knew the route from his work assignments during the settlement phase. He walked through the first night watching the sky. 2 moons rose and set. The temperature dropped until his breath froze in front of his face, but had endured worse. Life in the outer colonies was never comfortable. By morning, he saw the outpost. It was damaged but still standing. The colonists had left supplies when they evacuated. They always did. Someone might come back. Someone might need them. Spent 3 days reinforcing the structure and organizing the supplies. He had enough food for 3 months if he rationed it carefully. Water could be harvested from the underground sources he had found during his preliminary surveys. The colony's medical and equipment stores were still intact. On the 4th day, saw them. The creatures emerged from the rocky ridges to the north. The colonists had called them Vexlings, a name that meant nothing except that it described their appearance. They were massive, easily 20 meters from nose to tail. Their bodies were low and muscular, built for speed and power. Their skin was dark green with patterns that looked almost like scars. But it was their eyes that caught attention. Those eyes were intelligent. They tracked movement with purpose. The previous colony reports said the Vexlings were mindless predators. 12 colonists had died in encounters with them. The military response had been to hunt them. That response had gotten even more colonists killed. Watched from the outpost roof as the pack moved across the open ground. There were 7 of them. 2 were clearly larger and moved with a different kind of authority. The others followed in a specific pattern. It was not the movement of animals. It was the movement of a family with structure and purpose. The pack stopped about 500 meters from the outpost. The largest one, a male with patterns across its shoulder, turned his head toward. Their eyes met, did not move. The creature studied him for a long moment. Then the pack turned and moved away, disappearing into the rocky terrain. Released his breath slowly. That night he made a decision that confirmed what everyone already believed about him. He was foolish. He was unreliable. He was dangerous. He wrote a message on the colony's communication array, not requesting rescue but offering data. He explained that the red zone was not unsuitable for life. The colonists had simply made mistakes. They had treated every creature as an enemy. They had tried to conquer instead of coexist. The message would take 3 weeks to reach the main galactic station. By then, he would have either learned something useful or died. Either way, his choice was made. Began his real work. He set up observation stations around the outpost, recording everything he could see of the Vexlings' behavior. He learned their movement patterns. He discovered they hunted at specific times. They seemed to avoid certain areas for reasons he did not yet understand. They communicated with sounds that ranged from low rumbles to high-pitched whistles. On the 8th day alone, prepared food offerings and left them in a clearing far enough from the outpost that he could watch from cover. The pack found them by evening. The largest male, which decided to call Atlas, approached the food carefully. He sniffed it and looked in its direction even though it was completely hidden. Then Atlas ate. Felt his hands shake with something close to hope. For 2 weeks he continued this pattern. Leave food, Watch from hiding, record behavior, learn communication. The pack grew accustomed to his presence. They no longer ran when they sensed him. Atlas began to anticipate the food offerings, arriving at the clearing at almost the exact same time each day. Then came the night took his biggest risk. He walked into the clearing without hiding. He carried a single meal's worth of food and held his hands open and low. His suit's communication array was off. He was completely defenseless and visible. Atlas emerged from the darkness first. The creature's eyes glowed in the moonlight, could see the powerful muscles tense. He could see the jaw that could tear his body in half. Slowly lowered himself to the ground. He placed the food in front of him. He did not run. He did not fight. He simply sat and waited. Atlas approached. The creature's breath was hot even at a distance, kept his body loose and open, showing no aggression. Slowly, Atlas came closer. The massive head lowered. Could feel the creature's breath now, warm and strong. Atlas ate the food while sat unmoving. The weeks that followed were the most important of Cooper's life, though he did not know it yet. Each day brought new understanding. Each night brought new danger. He was walking a line between survival and discovery that could end either way. After that first contact with Atlas changed his approach. He stopped hiding. He positioned himself near the feeding areas, but always with open body language and non-threatening posture. The pack began to recognize him as part of their territory, not as prey or threat. This was the breakthrough that no colony had ever achieved. The female who led the pack with Atlas arrived one morning with 3 younger creatures. Understood immediately that she was their mother. She was smaller than Atlas but moved with absolute authority. Her patterns were different, almost like markings earned through battles he could only imagine. Decided to call her Luna. Luna approached differently than Atlas did. She studied him with the kind of intensity that made his survival instinct scream. This was a mother evaluating whether he was a danger to her offspring. Had the sense that if Luna decided he was a threat, all his careful work would end in violence. He did what his instincts told him to do. He turned his back to her and sat down. It was the most vulnerable position he could take. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Muscles were so tight they ached. Then he heard the soft sound of claws on stone as Luna moved. She passed directly behind him. Her breath moved the hair on the back of his neck. Then she was gone. Forced himself to sit motionless for another 10 minutes before turning around. Luna was watching him from a distance, her young ones playing in the dust nearby. Something had shifted. He had been tested and approved. Began keeping detailed journals, documenting every sound, every gesture, every pattern of behavior. He discovered that the Vexlings used a complex system of communication. The low rumbles seemed to signal danger or gathering calls. The high whistles appeared to mean success or contentment. There were clicking sounds that seemed connected to teaching the younger ones. There were growls that were clearly marks of dominance but not necessarily aggression. He recorded everything on his communication device, compiling data that would have been invaluable to the previous colonies if anyone had cared to observe instead of attack. One crucial discovery came when accessed the old colony records. He found reports from the last military encounters with the Vexlings. The details shocked him. The colonists had not just defended themselves. They had hunted the creatures deliberately. They had set traps. They had used explosives in the Vexlings' territory. They had killed juveniles. The Vexlings were not mindless killers. They were a species in mourning, defending their survivors against creatures that had murdered their families. Understood then why Atlas and Luna were so wary. They had watched their pack destroyed. That they were willing to coexist with him, an example of the same species that had attacked them, was an act of remarkable intelligence and mercy. He increased his food offerings, expanding the territory where he left meals. He built small shelters from stone and salvaged materials, creating protected spaces where the pack could rest safely. He began vocalizing with them, trying to mimic their sounds, though his human throat could not reproduce them properly. The attempt seemed to amuse them more than anything else. The breakthrough in communication came when Luna was injured. Found her limping toward the outpost during a pre-dawn watch. Her left side was bleeding heavily. Something large had torn into her flank. Realized immediately what this meant. There were other predators on 442B, creatures territorial enough to challenge even the Vexlings. Luna had been wounded in a territorial conflict. His first instinct was to run inside and hide. An injured creature was dangerous. A mother protecting herself would attack anything that came near, but he thought of his choice. He thought of why he had stayed on this dead planet. He moved slowly and deliberately toward Luna. He made his body open and harmless. He spoke in low, calm tones, repeating the sounds that seemed most peaceful. Luna's eyes tracked him, full of pain and aggression. Her teeth showed. Did not stop. He reached the supply kit he had salvaged from the colony. He took out the medical supplies and approached Luna with everything moving slowly. His hands were shaking. If she decided to attack, he would die. Luna snarled, her muscles tightened, but she did not move. Something in his approach, something in his slow and deliberate care told her that he meant to help, not harm. Clean the wound. He applied antiseptic, knowing it would sting and might make her attack. Luna growled but held still. He applied the regenerative gel that the colony had developed for wound treatment. He wrapped it with clean cloth, speaking constantly in soft tones. When he finished, Luna was shaking. Her breathing was heavy, stepped back, giving her space. He held his hands open and empty. Luna stood on shaky legs. She looked at with an intensity that communicated something he understood perfectly. This was not just recognition anymore. This was kinship. Over the next days, Luna recovered. The wound closed better than had expected. She began moving normally again, but everything had changed between them. She came to the outpost now with less caution. Atlas still maintained more distance, but even he seemed to accept presence more completely. The pack began to protect. When other creatures approached the outpost, the Vexlings would appear and drive them away. Found evidence of this defensive behavior when he discovered the remains of a smaller predator that had been killed near his shelter. The message was clear. This human was pack territory now. Threats would be eliminated. His food stores were running low. He started hunting small creatures and gathering the edible plants he had documented. Luna seemed to understand what he was doing. She began leaving kills near his shelter, food offerings that showed her own kind of respect and reciprocity. By the 8th week, had created something no colony before him had achieved. He had created a relationship, not submission, not dominance, but actual partnership between two different species. They had established mutual trust and mutual benefit. He provided medical care and protection within established boundaries. They provided food, protection from larger predators, and the kind of security that came from having powerful allies. Sent another message to the main station, this one far more detailed than the first. He described the Vexlings as intelligent beings capable of reason, emotion, and diplomatic relations. He documented his evidence. He made a claim that would seem impossible to anyone who had only known the previous failed colonies. The red zone was not. It just required a different kind of human to live there. It required someone willing to listen instead of conquer. Someone willing to understand instead of eliminate. Someone like him, but did not wait for a response. He was already planning something bigger. He was already imagining what could be built here, not on top of this world, but with it. And Atlas and Luna, watching him work and plan, seemed to understand exactly what he was thinking. Cooper had always been a builder. This was the one thing the colony administrators had gotten right about him, even if they had misunderstood everything else. He did not build structures to dominate the landscape. He built them to work with the natural environment, to move through it rather than destroy it. The outpost he had inherited was just the beginning. By the 3rd month of his solitary work, he had a vision that consumed him. He could transform the red zone, not by tamming it like the previous colonists had tried, but by understanding it and becoming part of it. The Vexlings could help him. Together, they could create something new. The first project was water management, had discovered underground springs in 3 locations around the outpost. The previous colonists had tried to pipe the water to centralized points through mechanical means, took a different approach. He studied how water moved naturally across the landscape. He built channels and collection points that worked with gravity and terrain. He created reservoirs where water could collect without being forced or pressurized. The Vexlings helped in ways he had not anticipated. When they saw what was building, they seemed to understand its purpose. They moved heavy stones that he could never shift alone. They used their strength to dig channels deeper and faster. Luna even seemed to supervise, making low, rumbling sounds that interpreted as approval or correction. By the 2nd week of construction, the water system was functioning. Clean, clear water flowed from the underground sources to storage areas near the outpost. It worked without electricity, without machines beyond basic tools. It would survive if disappeared tomorrow. Next came food production. The previous colonists had tried to grow earth crops in sealed agricultural domes, had watched those attempts fail. The soil was too different. The plants did not adapt. The energy consumption was unsustainable. Did something dangerous. He began experimenting with the native plants. The initial analyses from the colony had marked almost everything as toxic, but understood that toxic and incompatible were not the same thing. He studied which animals ate which plants. He observed the Vexlings' diet and what they avoided. He took samples and tested them carefully, starting with skin exposure and moving slowly to ingestion. Most of the plants remained dangerous, but some were not. A broad-leafed green plant with purple flowers could be eaten if properly dried and prepared. A root vegetable that grew in clusters near the water sources was actually quite nutritious. A grain-like seed could be harvested and ground. Slowly was documenting an edible landscape. He built terraces on the slopes around the outpost, creating flat areas for planting the edible species. The Vexlings helped again, moving soil and stone with their powerful bodies. Atlas seemed to understand that these plants were important. Once the terraces were established, the Vexlings actively protected them from smaller creatures that might have damaged them. By the fourth month was no longer simply surviving. He was thriving. He had food, water, and shelter. He had protection. He had partners in the literal sense. But survival was not enough. Wanted to build something that could expand. He wanted to create a settlement that could welcome others, people like him who saw possibility where others saw only death. The construction of the main settlement began in the fifth month. Chose a location 3 kilometers from the original outpost. It was positioned on higher ground with water access, but far enough away that the Vexlings would not feel their territory was being invaded. He built carefully, using principles he had learned from studying how the native creatures organized their own spaces. The structures were not like colony domes. They were open to the environment while providing shelter. He used stone and salvaged materials from the failed colonies, creating buildings that felt integrated with the landscape rather than imposed upon it. The roofs were angled to channel water to cisterns. The walls were thick enough to provide temperature regulation without requiring active heating systems. Most importantly, he left spaces for the Vexlings, paths that would let the pack move through the settlement, open areas where they could rest without feeling trapped. It was a settlement designed for humans and the creatures of 442B to share. The work was exhausting. His body grew lean and strong. His hands developed calluses from labor. He cut his hair short because long hair collected too much dust from the construction. He stopped thinking of himself as a colonist from another world. He was becoming something new. He was becoming a resident of the Red Zone. Luna gave birth to 3 new young during the 6th month, was honored when she brought them to see the settlement. The tiny creatures played around the construction sites, and the Vexlings actively helped protect them while worked. It was clear now that the pack had truly accepted him. He was not just tolerated. He was considered safe within their family unit. Sent regular messages to the main station, updating his observations. He included data on sustainable agriculture, water management without mechanical systems, and most importantly, documentation of successful coexistence with an intelligent native species. He knew his messages would arrive weeks late and responses would take weeks more. But he was not building for immediate approval. He was building for long-term success. In the 8th month, something significant happened. A creature had never seen before, a massive reptilian predator with armor plating and cruel intelligence, approached the settlement. This was not a territorial intrusion by the Vexlings. This was a genuine threat from an unknown apex predator. Watched from inside one of his finished structures as the creature circled the settlement. He saw the moment Atlas and Luna recognized the threat. The pack responded with coordinated action that was breathtaking in its efficiency. The Vexlings formed a barrier between the predator and the human structures. The creature, recognizing a serious threat to its safety. But the message was clear. The Vexlings were willing to defend, and his work with violence if necessary. They had evolved from being simply neutral to being actively protective. Whatever bonds had been created between them had become genuine alliance. By the 10th month, stood on the highest point of his new settlement and surveyed what he had built. Multiple structures, agricultural terraces producing food, water systems functioning perfectly, paths and spaces designed for the Vexlings to move freely, and most importantly, evidence that humans and another intelligent species could build something together. The settlement was not just, it was thriving. And more than that, it was beautiful in its integration with the natural environment, had created something that the colony authorities would have thought impossible. The ships arrived without warning, was working on expanding the agricultural terraces when he saw them descend through the atmosphere. 3 vessels, not transport ships but official Galactic Council vessels. They carried inspectors and decision-makers. They carried the people who would determine whether his work had meaning or whether it was just the delusion of a man alone on a hostile world. He recognized Dr. Hayes from the communication archives. She was the chief assigned to evaluate his claims. She was known in the colony system for her skepticism and rigid adherence to established protocols. She was exactly the kind of person who would look at everything had built and see only the desperate struggles of a madman. Beside Hayes came military personnel, at least a dozen of them. They wore combat gear and carried weapons designed for dealing with large creatures. They looked at the red zone the same way the previous colonists had looked at it, as something to be conquered and controlled. And there was Administrator Dell. Recognized him immediately. Dell was the man who had removed him from the main colony roster. Dell was the administrator who had written in his file that Cooper was unreliable and questioned authority too much. Dell was here, and he looked interested in proving that survival had been pure luck or stubborn stupidity, not actual capability. The landing site was a kilometer from the settlement. Could have hidden. Instead, he walked toward the ships as they deployed their crews. He was unarmed. His clothes were dust-covered and worn. He looked exactly like what everyone probably expected, a man barely surviving in an unlivable zone. Hayes assessed him with a clinical gaze. Her first words were spoken into a recording device rather than to him directly. She was documenting everything for the official record. Understood that she had already made her determination. She was here to prove him wrong, not to verify his claims. "The settlement is intact," she said, looking at the structures had built. "That is noteworthy if it is indeed his construction." "It is," said simply. Dell smiled without warmth. "Cooper, still making poor decisions, I see. How exactly did you imagine you would survive here alone?" Did not answer immediately. He gestured toward the settlement and the terraces and the water systems, all of it visible from where they stood. "I did not survive alone. I learned to cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" Hayes asked, her eyes narrowing. "The geological surveys show no other human population in this zone." Before could answer, the Vexlings appeared. The military personnel immediately raised their weapons. The creatures were only doing what they did now, approaching in a non-aggressive manner to examine these new visitors in their territory. But to humans trained to see them only as threats, it looked like an attack forming. "Do not shoot," commanded, his voice sharp. Then he did something that made every military officer tense further. He walked directly toward Atlas, the alpha male, and placed his hand on the creature's scaled neck. "They will kill him," one of the soldiers said, weapon raised. But Atlas did not kill. The creature made a low rumbling sound and lowered his massive head in a gesture that could only be described as greeting. Luna came up beside as well, her presence calm and deliberate. The 3 younger Vexlings that had been born during time on 442B played in the dust, completely unconcerned with the armed humans. Hayes' scientific recorder was working continuously, capturing every moment. Dell's expression had shifted from skepticism to something else. Shock, perhaps, unease. "Extraordinary," Hayes said softly, speaking into her recorder. "The creatures are exhibiting clear behavioral patterns of social bonding with the human subject. This contradicts all previous documentation." "All previous documentation was based on military encounters," said. He kept his hand on Atlas' neck, drawing strength from the contact. "The colonists attacked the Vexlings. The creatures responded defensively. Everyone interpreted that as mindless predation. It was actually species protecting themselves from invasion." One of the younger soldiers moved closer to examine the creatures more carefully. He was not raising his weapon, just moving to get a better look. The Vexlings, seeing this as intrusion, responded with a territorial display. Atlas made a sound that was unmistakably a warning. The soldier froze. "Stand down," called to the soldier. Then to Atlas, he made a low, rumbling vocalization that approximated one of the creature's own calls. Atlas immediately relaxed. The warning was over. Hayes recorded this interaction intently. "You have achieved actual communication with them, not instinctual response, deliberate communication." They are intelligent, said. They have social structures, family units, complex hierarchy, and decision-making capability. They are not animals in any meaningful sense. They are another species trying to survive on the same planet. Dell was silent. His eyes moved from to the Vexlings and back, could see the calculations happening. This did not fit the narrative that had been established. This did not support the conclusion that the red zone was. Hayes approached carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. She was applying the same techniques he had used with the creatures, non-threatening approach, open body language. I would like to document your methods more thoroughly, with your permission. The Vexlings will need to approve, said. But I believe they will. They are accustomed to peaceful observation. Over the next hours, Hayes spent time watching interact with the creatures. She observed his vocalizations, his body language, his careful respect for the Vexlings' boundaries. She toured the settlement and examined the water systems, the agricultural terraces, the structures. She took samples of the cultivated plants and conducted preliminary analysis. Meanwhile, Dell watched with growing frustration. This was not playing out the way he had expected. The administrator had likely come expecting to find barely alive in a hastily constructed shelter, barely surviving on minimal resources. Instead, he found a thriving settlement and a man whose work had accomplished something no previous colony had achieved. Late in the afternoon, one of the younger Vexlings became injured. It was a small wound from rough play with its siblings, but it was bleeding. Immediately retrieved his medical kit. Before he could approach, Luna moved between him and the injured young one. She was protecting her offspring, ready to strike if he represented danger. Stopped, he lowered himself to the ground and made a soft, specific sound. He had used this sound dozens of times to signal peaceful medical intention. Luna observed him for a long moment. Then, remarkably, she stepped aside. Treated the wound while Atlas watched from nearby. The injury was minor, easily dealt with. But what mattered was what everyone was observing. The Vexlings trusted with their offspring. They trusted him with their family. Hayes was watching intently, could see her processing this moment. This was not desperation. This was not a man simply trying to survive. This was genuine partnership between species. That evening, Hayes called a formal meeting in one of the settlement structures. She presented her preliminary findings. The water systems were efficient and sustainable. The agricultural plants were genuinely edible and nutritious. The structures were well designed for environmental integration. Most importantly, the human subject had established verifiable communication and partnership protocols with the native sapient species. The red zone is habitable, Hayes concluded. More than that, it appears to be perfectly suited for a new model of settlement, one based on cooperation rather than conquest. Dell tried to argue for military installation and territorial control. He suggested that the Vexlings could be domesticated or eliminated. He proposed extracting valuable resources under human authority. Hayes rejected every proposal. Her scientific integrity demanded honoring the evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Over the following days, the debate continued, but Hayes had begun to see what had seen. She had begun to understand why a man thought unreliable and problematic had stayed on this dead world, because it was not dead. It was alive. It just required someone willing to listen instead of conquer. 1 year had passed since the official recognition. The red zone had transformed from a dead planet into something vibrant and alive. Cooper had transformed too. The man who had been labeled problematic and unreliable was now the settlement director of 442B. More importantly, he was something far beyond titles. He was a pioneer of a new way of living. The first colonists arrived in 3 ships. 30 people carefully selected not for military training or administrative skill, but for adaptability and genuine curiosity. They were teachers, engineers, botanists, and yes, some soldiers too. But the soldiers had been chosen because they understood that protection sometimes meant creating barriers, not just fighting threats. They understood the difference between defense and aggression. Personally trained each new colonist in the protocols of coexistence. He taught them the Vexlings' vocalizations. He taught them body language that communicated non-threat. He taught them that mistakes would not be forgiven by creatures that were more intelligent than humans gave them credit for. The new colonists learned quickly. They had to. 442B did not tolerate arrogance or careless assumptions. Either you adapted or you failed. Within weeks, the settlement had doubled in population. Within 2 months, it had tripled. People came because they wanted to be part of something different. They came because Cooper had proven that another way was possible. The settlement expanded in careful, deliberate ways. New structures were built using the same principles had pioneered, integration with the environment rather than domination of it. Paths for the Vexlings remained clear. Water systems expanded to serve more residents. Agricultural production increased as more colonists learned which native plants were edible and which were dangerous. Most remarkably, actual diplomatic protocols were established with the Vexlings, designated meeting areas where humans and creatures could interact under controlled circumstances. Communications specialists worked to develop a more structured vocabulary of sounds and gestures. By the end of the first year, there were humans who could genuinely communicate basic concepts with the creatures. Luna gave birth to 5 more young. The pack had grown to over 30 members, making it one of the largest Vexling groups on the planet. They had become not just protectors, but partners in the settlement's expansion and development. When new agricultural areas needed to be opened, the Vexlings cleared dangerous creatures and prepared the land. When dangerous weather threatened the settlement, the creatures provided shelter and protection. But the true test of everything had built came in the 8th month. One of the younger Vexlings, a 3-year-old male named by the colonists as Storm, became severely ill. Fever him. His breathing became labored. He refused food. The pack was devastated. Luna spent hours beside her offspring, making soft, grief-stricken sounds that even humans without training could understand. Knew what was happening. An infection. Bacterial or viral, it did not matter. Without medical intervention, the creature would die. And if Storm died, if the Vexlings believed the settlement residents had failed to protect one of their own despite all the promises of partnership, everything had built would collapse into conflict. He went to Luna with the settlement's medical specialist, Dr. Shaw. Shaw was nervous. He had never attempted to treat a creature the size of a Vexling. He carried antibiotics and diagnostic equipment designed for human biology, completely untested on an alien species. "If we do this wrong, we kill him," Shaw said quietly. "If we do nothing, he dies anyway," replied. "And then everything we have built dies with him." Luna allowed them to approach. She was desperate now, her normal protective instincts overwhelmed by the need for help. Worked with Shaw, using everything he had learned about Vexling physiology to guide the treatment. He explained the medication injection. He demonstrated the antibiotic would not harm. He asked permission through vocalization and gesture. Luna understood. She held her offspring still while the humans worked. Shaw, with guidance, administered the medication. They set up a monitoring system, checking Storm's temperature and breathing at regular intervals. For 2 days, nothing changed. Storm remained fevered and barely conscious. The pack was silent, watching the colonists with an intensity that suggested they were being judged. If the creature died, the judgment would be harsh. On the 3rd day, Storm's fever broke. The young Vexling's eyes cleared. His breathing became normal. He looked at Luna and Shaw, and something shifted in his expression. Curiosity. Gratitude, perhaps, in whatever way creatures experience such emotions. Luna made sounds that the settlement's communication specialists later described as thanksgiving. She brought her offspring, too. Storm sniffed him and made a soft vocalization that was clearly mimicry of his own communication attempts. The young creature had bonded with and Shaw, the beings who had saved its life. More than that, Storm had become living proof that humans and Vexlings could work together, could trust each other in the most critical moments. Established a formal research station in partnership with the university system back on the Galactic Council's central worlds. Dr. Hayes became the lead researcher, working remotely but constantly developing new protocols for communication and cooperation. The work she conducted on 442b began to influence how the entire galactic civilization approached newly discovered intelligent species. Other planets began requesting visits from S team, zones marked as were being reconsidered. The approach of understanding and coexistence began to spread, not everywhere. Some governments still preferred military solutions and territorial control, but this experiment had proven that another way worked. In the settlement's 2nd year, something remarkable happened. A second pack of Vexlings was discovered in previously unexplored territory. Normally, different packs were hostile to each other, but these creatures had heard about the human settlement through sounds and travel patterns that demonstrated sophisticated information sharing. They approached not with aggression, but with caution and interest. was prepared. Using everything he had learned from Atlas and Luna, he established diplomatic relations with the new pack as well. Within months, there were two separate packs coexisting in proximity to the human settlement, both engaging in cooperative activities, both protecting and being protected by the humans. The settlement had become something unprecedented in the galaxy, a place where multiple species lived together by choice, bound by mutual interest and genuine respect rather than forced hierarchy. On the anniversary of his recognition as settlement director, stood at the highest point of the now massive settlement. The structures had. The agricultural terraces had expanded into a full agricultural region. The population had grown to over 500 colonists. Paths and spaces for the Vexlings had expanded as well. Atlas was beside him, as he had been through all of this. The alpha male was aging now, his body bearing the scars of many seasons, but his eyes remained intelligent and present. Luna was resting nearby with her latest offspring, now teaching the young ones about the humans and the partnership that existed between their species. A group of younger colonists was walking through the settlement, training with one of its lieutenants in proper communication protocols. They were laughing as they practiced the vocalizations, getting the sounds wrong and trying again. Behind them, two young Vexlings were doing the same, attempting to replicate human sounds and failing in ways that were endearing rather than concerning. "Look what we built," someone said beside him. It was Dr. Hayes. She had arrived on a visitor's vessel for a formal inspection and research update. She looked at the settlement with an expression that was almost wonder. "What you helped us build," said. "Your belief in the evidence mattered." Hayes smiled. "I believed in you, I believed you were telling the truth, but I could not have predicted this." She gestured at the settlement, at the coexistence, at the young colonists and young Vexlings learning together. "This is transformation beyond survival. This is evolution." Thought about his choice to stay on 442B when everyone told him he was foolish. He thought about the months of observation and careful approach. He thought about the moment he had sat defenseless in a clearing and chosen trust instead of fear. "Authority is not always right," he said quietly. "That is what I learned. Everyone told me the red zone was, they had data. They had records of failed colonies. They had evidence that seemed conclusive, but they did not have curiosity. They did not have willingness to question their own understanding." "And that made all the difference," Hayes said. By the third year, settlement on 442B had become a model for the entire galactic civilization. New settlement protocols were established throughout the galaxy based on his principles of understanding before conquest. Species that had been marked as dangerous were given researchers and observers instead of military forces. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the approach to new worlds and new intelligent species began to shift. Received messages from other settlements now. Messages from humans who had applied his methods on other hostile planets and found similar results. Messages from researchers who had discovered that many species marked as incompatible with human habitation were actually simply incompatible with human aggression. But remained on 442B. This was his world now. The red zone had transformed into the blue settlement because of the appearance of its water systems and the flourishing life that surrounded them. His name would be remembered, but he did not care about remembrance. He cared about the work. He walked through the settlement each day with Atlas and Luna beside him, watching the humans and Vexlings work together, watching the young ones of both species play together, watching what emerged when fear was replaced by understanding. In a small gesture, had changed the trajectory of galactic civilization, not through weapons or conquest, not through superior technology or military might, through the simple belief that another way was possible, through the willingness to listen to creatures marked as monsters, through the courage to sit defenseless in a clearing and offer trust. The greatest strength of humanity, had proven, was not in domination. It was in compassion. It was in the willingness to learn. It was in the recognition that intelligence and consciousness could take forms different from their own and still deserve respect. As the twin moons rose over the settlement, casting blue-green light across the structures and terraces and paths, stood with his hand on Atlas' neck and understood that the red zone had never been. It had only been waiting for someone with the courage to arrive with open hands instead of weapons. That person had been him, and everything had changed. By the end of the inspection, Hayes had officially recommended that be granted settlement authority over the red zone. She recommended that future colonists be selected for adaptability and open-mindedness rather than military capability. She recommended that the Vexlings be recognized as an intelligent species entitled to rights and territorial protection. Del fought these recommendations all the way back to the Galactic Council, but Hayes' position as chief gave her authority he could not override. The decision came through official transmission 1 week after the inspection team departed. Was granted permanent settlement authority over 442B's red zone. The area was officially recognized as Cooper's territory and responsibility, and most remarkably, the Vexlings were recognized as a protected intelligent species. Stood with Atlas and Luna, watching the transmission confirmation scroll across his communication screen. Everything had changed, or rather, everything had finally been recognized for what it actually was. The foolish man who stayed had been proven right, not through luck, not through desperation, but through genuine understanding and the courage to believe in something different. He sent his final message to the station, not a request for help, but an invitation. Come see what can be done when you stop trying to conquer and start trying to understand. Come see the red zone transformed not by human dominance, but by human cooperation. He did not know how long it would take for the message to arrive. He did not know if anyone would believe him, but he knew his work was not finished. This was just the beginning. The Vexlings, watching his continued building and planning, seemed to understand his vision completely. Atlas stood beside him on that high point, looking out over the new settlement, and made a low, rumbling sound that had learned to recognize as contentment and pride. When the meal was finished, Atlas looked at directly. In that moment, something changed between them. It was not trust, not yet, but it was recognition. It was the understanding that they were two intelligent beings choosing peace instead of violence. Atlas turned and moved back toward the darkness, remained still for another hour after the creature disappeared. His hands were steady now. His heart had stopped racing. He was not alone anymore, and this time when help finally arrived, they would see not a foolish man who stayed on a dead world. They would see something that changed everything.